After 18 years of marriage, I found a box of love letters in his closet. All dated this year, none addressed to me. I read every word. Next morning, he found them spread across the breakfast table, next to his coffee, and a note that changed everything. The passport folder should have been right there on the top shelf. Christopher always kept our important documents in the same burgundy leather folder. Birth certificates, marriage license, social security cards, and those 2 navy blue passports we'd used for our anniversary trip to Italy 3 years ago. Our weekend getaway to the mountains was supposed to be spontaneous, romantic even. Just the 2 of us, no phones, no distractions. I was excited, humming while I rifled through our walk-in closet. But the folder wasn't where it belonged. I pushed aside Christopher's winter coats, the heavy wool one I'd bought him last Christmas still smelling faintly of his cologne. Behind the thick fabric, my fingers brushed against something unexpected, smooth, polished wood. A box I'd never seen before, roughly the size of a shoebox but crafted from what looked like cherry wood, with delicate brass hinges that caught the overhead light. My heart began to race, though I couldn't explain why. Something about the way it was hidden, deliberately tucked behind the coats where I'd never think to look, sent a chill down my spine. The weight of it surprised me as I lifted it out. Heavier than expected, substantial. My hands trembled slightly as I carried it to our bed, that California king we'd picked out together when we moved into this house 12 years ago. The lid opened with a soft creak. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these deeply personal stories. If you believe that marriages can survive even the most devastating betrayals through honesty and courage, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more couples who need hope. Now let's see how this unfolds. 13 envelopes lay nestled inside, each one cream-colored and pristine, tied together with a silk scarf I recognized, the emerald green one Christopher had given me for Mother's Day 2 years ago. The same scarf I'd worn to our daughter Emma's graduation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own gift was being used to bind together secrets I knew nothing about. Christopher's handwriting was unmistakable, those distinctive loops and careful slants I'd seen on birthday cards, grocery lists and love notes for 18 years. But these weren't addressed to me. Each envelope bore the same name in his careful script, Ashley. My fingers went numb. Ashley. The name echoed in my mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of confusion and dread through my thoughts. I didn't know any Ashley. Christopher had never mentioned an Ashley. Yet here were 13 letters, all bearing recent dates, some from just weeks ago. The first envelope felt fragile in my hands, as if it might crumble under the weight of whatever secrets it contained. I slid my finger under the flap, the paper giving way with a whisper. The letter inside was written on Christopher's personal stationery, the kind with his initials embossed at the top that he used for formal correspondence. "My dearest Ashley," it began. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the edge of our bed, the same bed where Christopher and I had shared morning coffee, late-night conversations, and countless intimate moments. Now it felt foreign, tainted by the presence of these letters that spoke of a life I didn't know existed. "Do you remember that little coffee shop near campus? The one with the crooked tables and the barista who always drew hearts in the foam? I walked past it yesterday during my business trip to Portland, and I swear I could still smell the cinnamon rolls we used to share. You always ordered yours with extra icing and I'd tease you about having a sweet tooth. But secretly, I loved watching you lick the sugar from your fingers, completely unself-conscious and beautiful." My throat constricted. College. Portland. A business trip he'd taken just last month, returning with stories about boring meetings and bad hotel coffee. He'd never mentioned walking through his old campus. He'd never mentioned remembering someone named Ashley. I forced myself to continue reading, though each word felt like a small betrayal. The letter described shared memories I'd never heard, study sessions that turned into deep conversations, walks through autumn leaves, a moment under the campus library stairs where they'd almost kissed but didn't. The tenderness in his words was unmistakable, the kind of raw emotion I thought he reserved only for me. With shaking hands I reached for the second letter. Then the third. Each one revealed more pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed. Ashley wasn't just a memory, she was a living, breathing presence in Christopher's heart. The letters spoke of recent dreams where she appeared, of wondering what their children might have looked like, of regret so deep it seemed to consume him. "I saw a woman at the grocery store last week who looked just like you," One letter read. Same auburn hair, same way of tilting her head when she laughed. For a moment my heart stopped. I actually followed her down the cereal aisle before I realized what I was doing. The poor woman probably thought I was some kind of stalker. But for those few seconds, I let myself imagine what it would be like to run into you, to see you smile at me the way you used to. The dates on the letters painted a timeline of secret longing. February, March, April, May. While I was planning our anniversary dinner, he was writing love letters to another woman. While I was picking out new curtains for our bedroom, he was pouring his heart out to someone from his past. Some letters were angry, not at Ashley but at himself. He wrote about the choices he'd made, the paths not taken, the life he'd built that sometimes felt like a consolation prize. Those words cut the deepest because they implied that our marriage, our family, our entire life together was somehow second best. But it was the 13th letter, dated just 2 weeks ago, that shattered something inside me completely. I've carried this love for you for 21 years in absolute silence, Ashley. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you, wondered about you, loved you from afar. But I never told Jessica about you. I never told her that part of my heart has always belonged to someone else. I didn't want to break her heart. She's a good woman, a wonderful mother, and she deserves better than to know she's been sharing her husband with a ghost. But I can't carry this alone anymore. I need you to know that you were my first love, my truest love, and if I could go back and choose differently, I would choose you every time. The letter fell from my hands, floating to the hardwood floor like a dying leaf. He'd written my name like I was a character in someone else's story, a supporting player in the drama of his real life. 21 years. He'd loved her for 21 years, which meant he'd loved her even before he met me. Our entire relationship had been built on the foundation of his unfinished business with another woman. I didn't cry. The hurt was too deep for tears, too complete for any normal emotional response. I just sat there in the silence of our bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's secret life, feeling hollow and weightless, as if I might simply float away and disappear. The woman I'd been when I woke up that morning, Christopher's wife, Emma's mother, a woman secure in her marriage and her place in the world, that woman was gone. In her place sat a stranger holding love letters that were never meant for her, understanding finally that she'd been living someone else's life all along. The letters scattered around me on the bedroom floor became a cruel backdrop for the flood of memories that suddenly demanded re-examination. 24 years old, fresh out of college, working my first real job at the marketing firm downtown. That's who I was when Christopher walked into my life. Or rather, when I walked into his apartment building's laundry room and found him staring helplessly at my broken toaster. I think I can fix this, he'd said, holding up the burnt appliance with a sheepish grin. His hands were gentle as he worked, explaining something about heating elements and electrical connections that I pretended to understand just to keep him talking. Those same hands that had written love letters to Ashley just 2 weeks ago. The memory shifted, taking on a sinister new quality. Had he been thinking of her even then? When he'd successfully repaired my toaster and I'd impulsively invited him for coffee to celebrate, had some part of his mind been elsewhere, comparing my laugh to hers, my smile to whatever he remembered of Ashley's? Our first apartment, that tiny studio with the slanted ceiling and radiator that clanged all night. We'd pushed all the furniture against the walls one evening and danced to an old jazz record I'd found at a thrift store. No music lessons, no choreography, just two people moving together in bare feet on cold hardwood floors. Christopher had spun me around until I was dizzy with laughter, and when the song ended he'd pulled me close and whispered, "I could do this forever." But did he mean it? Or was he thinking about dancing with someone else, someone with auburn hair who tilted her head when she laughed? The proposal. God, the proposal. We'd been walking home from dinner when the sky opened up. One of those sudden summer storms that appear out of nowhere. Instead of running for shelter, Christopher had stopped right there on the sidewalk, rain soaking through his shirt, water dripping from his hair. He'd reached into his pocket and I'd started laughing because I thought he was going for his phone to call an Uber. "Jessica," he'd said, and his voice had this quality I'd never heard before, urgent, almost desperate. "I can't wait another second." I'd said yes before he'd even finished getting down on one knee, before he'd managed to open the ring box with his rain-slicked fingers. The diamond had looked impossibly bright against the gray storm, and I'd thought it was the most romantic moment of my life. Now I wondered, had the urgency in his voice been love or guilt? Had he been trying to convince himself as much as propose to me? Emma's birth. Our daughter arriving 3 weeks early after 14 hours of labor that left me exhausted and trembling. Christopher had held my hand through every contraction, whispering encouragements, wiping sweat from my forehead with a damp cloth. When Emma finally emerged red-faced and screaming, he'd cried harder than I had. "She's perfect," he'd sobbed, kissing my forehead, my cheeks, my hands. "You're both perfect. I love you so much." But which had he meant? Was Ashley somewhere in that hospital room with us, an invisible presence sharing what should have been our most intimate moment? My father's funeral 2 years later hit me like a physical blow all over again. Dad had been sick for months, but I'd convinced myself he'd recover. When the call came at 3 a.m, Christopher had held me while I fell apart, his arms strong and steady around my shaking shoulders. He'd handled everything: the funeral arrangements, the flowers, the endless stream of casseroles from neighbors. He'd written my father's eulogy when I couldn't find the words, and he'd read it at the service because my voice kept breaking. Standing graveside, watching dirt fall onto my father's casket, I'd leaned into Christopher's warmth and felt grateful for his unwavering presence. He'd been my rock, my anchor, the one constant in a world that suddenly felt uncertain and fragile. But had part of him been wishing Ashley was there to comfort him through his own grief at watching me suffer? The signs had been there, hadn't they? Those moments when we'd be talking about our college years and his eyes would go distant, unfocused, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. I'd assumed he was remembering late-night study sessions or weekend parties. Normal nostalgia for a time when life was simpler. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices back then?" he'd asked once out of nowhere, while we were watching Emma play in our backyard sandbox. "What kind of different choices?" I'd asked, genuinely curious. He'd been quiet for so long I'd thought he hadn't heard me. Then, nothing specific. Just, "You know how it is. Wondering about roads not taken." I'd laughed it off, made some joke about how the road we'd taken had led us to Emma and this house and Sunday morning pancakes, so clearly we'd chosen well. He'd smiled and kissed my temple, but something in his expression had remained distant, almost melancholy. Now I understood. He hadn't been thinking about abstract choices or philosophical whats. He'd been thinking about Ashley. The oldies station in the car would sometimes play songs from the late 90s, early 2000s, music from our college years. I'd try to sing along, maybe reach over and turn up the volume, but Christopher would go quiet, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. I'd attributed it to his general dislike of loud music, his preference for talk radio or classical. But those were Ashley's songs, weren't they? The soundtrack to whatever romance had played out between them while I was living my own oblivious college life across the country. How many times had I misread his silences? How many moments of what I'd thought was contentment had actually been him fighting memories of someone else? When he'd stare out the kitchen window while I made dinner, was he seeing our garden, or was he seeing Ashley's face? The cruelest realization was that Christopher had been a good husband. He'd never missed an anniversary, never forgotten a birthday. He'd brought me flowers every Friday for the first 5 years of our marriage just because. He'd rubbed my feet when I was pregnant, gotten up for midnight feedings without complaint, taught Emma to ride a bike and helped her with algebra homework and walked her to the bus stop every morning until she decided she was too old for parental escorts. But had it all been an elaborate performance? A carefully constructed life built to bury his real feelings? Or, and this possibility terrified me more, had he genuinely loved me while simultaneously loving someone else, compartmentalizing his heart in ways I couldn't fathom? The worst part was the uncertainty. I could handle betrayal, even emotional infidelity, if I understood its dimensions. But this felt like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. Had our entire marriage been authentic, just incomplete? Or had I been living with a stranger who'd gotten very good at pretending? The woman staring back at me from our bedroom mirror looked hollow-eyed and lost, holding the fragments of a life that might have been built on sand. Everything I'd thought I knew, about Christopher, about us, about the story of our love, suddenly felt as fragile and uncertain as those letters scattered across our floor. The hollowness followed me into a restless sleep, and I woke at 4:47 a.m. with the kind of clarity that only comes from emotional exhaustion. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, smaller somehow, as if the walls had contracted around secrets I could no longer ignore. Christopher slept beside me, his breathing steady and untroubled, one arm flung across the space where I usually curled against his chest. I slipped out of bed without disturbing him, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. The morning routine felt automatic. Fill the coffee maker, measure the grounds, set the timer. But every familiar motion carried new weight. This was the same kitchen where we'd shared thousands of breakfasts, where Emma had eaten her first solid food, where Christopher had surprised me with birthday cake at midnight 3 years running. The 13 letters lay exactly where I'd left them on our bed, scattered like fallen leaves. I gathered them carefully, my hands steadier now than they'd been the night before. Each envelope felt lighter somehow, as if reading them had drained away their power to shock me. But their weight in my arms was substantial, the physical manifestation of 21 years of hidden longing. I arranged them on our kitchen table with methodical precision, fanning them out like tarot cards that had already revealed their devastating fortune. The cream-colored paper caught the under-cabinet lighting, and Christopher's careful handwriting seemed to glow in the semi-darkness. Ashley, Ashley, Ashley. Her name repeated across the envelopes like an incantation. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with its familiar rhythm. I pulled Christopher's favorite mug from the cabinet, the navy blue one Emma had made in her high school ceramics class, slightly lopsided but functional, with "World's Best Dad" painted in her careful adolescent script. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was serving what might be our last normal morning coffee in a cup that celebrated his role as a father while I grappled with his failure as a husband. I found a paper napkin in the drawer, one of the everyday white ones we used for quick meals and weekend lunches. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just a simple square of paper that would hold what felt like the most important words I'd ever written. The pen felt impossibly heavy in my hand, as if it weighed 50 pounds instead of ounces. I stared at the blank napkin for several minutes, searching for the right words. Anger would have been easier. Accusations, demands, threats. But anger felt too small for this moment, too reactive for the magnitude of what I'd discovered. "You have my permission to marry her," I wrote, the ink flowing smoothly across the paper. No hard feelings. Just truth. The words looked stark and final on the napkin, but they felt right. Not vindictive or bitter, just honest. I wasn't giving him permission out of generosity. I was acknowledging that I couldn't compete with a ghost, couldn't fight a battle I'd never known I was losing. 21 years of loving someone else in silence had earned him the right to stop pretending. I signed my name at the bottom, Jessica, and placed the napkin beside his coffee mug. The scene looked almost normal from a distance, like any other morning arrangement of breakfast items. Only the letters spread across the table revealed the truth of what was happening. The overnight bag came together quickly. A change of clothes, toiletries, my phone charger. I avoided looking at the framed photos on our dresser, the vacation souvenirs, the small accumulations of a shared life that now felt like museum pieces from someone else's marriage. Emma's door was still closed when I passed her room, but I could hear her alarm going off, that annoying pop song she'd chosen specifically because it was impossible to ignore. I knocked softly and slipped inside without waiting for an answer. She was already sitting up in bed, her dark hair tousled from sleep, looking so much like Christopher that my chest tightened. "Mom, you're up early. I need to go stay with Aunt May for a day or two," I said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Nothing for you to worry about. Just some grown-up stuff I need to work through." Emma's 17-year-old radar for parental drama activated immediately. "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" I reached over and smoothed her hair back from her forehead, the same gesture I'd used to comfort her since she was small. "We're going to be fine. I just need some space to think about some things. You be good, okay? And if you need anything, call me." She nodded, but I could see the questions in her eyes, the worry that came from being old enough to sense when something was seriously wrong but young enough to feel powerless to fix it. I hugged her longer than usual, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, trying to memorize the feeling of being needed by someone who loved me without conditions or complications. The drive to May's house took 15 minutes through empty suburban streets. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft pastels that seemed too beautiful for such a devastating morning. I parked in her driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the house where my sister had built her own version of domestic happiness, different from mine but equally real, equally fragile. May opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting for me. She was already dressed despite the early hour, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her eyes alert with concern. Coffee? She asked, stepping aside to let me in. I just made some for Christopher, I said, then felt the bitter irony of those words. The coffee I'd made to accompany his discovery of my note, his realization that I knew about Ashley, his recognition that our marriage had just shifted into unknown territory. May nodded and disappeared into her kitchen, returning with a steaming mug of tea instead. Earl Grey with a slice of lemon, exactly how she'd made it for me during every crisis since we were children. She set it on the coffee table beside her couch and settled into the opposite chair, waiting. That's who May had always been. The sister who didn't need explanations, who created space for whatever needed to happen. She'd sat with me like this when I'd failed my driver's test, when my college boyfriend had broken up with me, when I'd struggled with postpartum depression after Emma was born. Never pushing, never demanding details, just present and steady and unshakable. I spent the morning staring at the photographs covering her mantle, family pictures spanning decades, including several of Christopher and me from happier times. Our wedding day, Emma's baptism, last Christmas morning with everyone gathered around May's tree. In one photo from our honeymoon in Greece, Christopher and I were laughing at something off camera, our faces bright with the kind of joy that looked almost foreign to me now. I stood up and walked over to that particular frame, studying our younger selves. Had Ashley been in his thoughts even then, on our honeymoon, while we were discovering the ancient ruins of Santorini and making love in our hotel room overlooking the Aegean Sea? The question felt like a physical weight in my chest. Without thinking, I reached out and turned the frame face down on the mantle. The small action felt both petty and necessary, a tiny rebellion against the woman I used to be. The one who'd believed in fairy tales and forever promises and the fantasy that love was simple and pure and unconditional. May watched from her chair but said nothing, and I loved her for that silence, for understanding that some moments required witness rather than commentary. The afternoon stretched endlessly at May's house, each hour marked by the steady tick of her grandfather clock and the occasional murmur of neighbors going about their ordinary lives. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, though I wasn't sure what I expected. An angry call, desperate voicemails, radio silence. The uncertainty felt worse than any specific response would have. At 6:47 p.m. my phone buzzed. The message was shorter than I'd anticipated, lacking the elaborate explanations or frantic apologies I'd imagined. Just 17 words that somehow managed to acknowledge everything and nothing simultaneously. Love that never lived isn't love. It's longing. And you were never second place. I read it 3 times, then showed it to May without explanation. She adjusted her reading glasses, studied the screen, and handed it back with a slight nod that could have meant anything. He's coming over, I said, though Christopher hadn't mentioned that in his text. Something about the tone, the careful choice of words, told me he wouldn't leave things hanging in digital space. He was the kind of man who needed to see faces, to gauge reactions, to finish difficult conversations in person. 20 minutes later, his truck pulled into May's driveway with the familiar rumble of an engine that needed new mufflers. I watched from behind her living room curtains as he sat in the cab for several minutes, hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house like it might hold answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. When he finally knocked, May answered the door with the same calm efficiency she'd shown all day. "She's on the porch," I heard her say, followed by the sound of the screen door closing behind him. The porch swing had been May's addition when she'd bought this house 15 years ago. A wide wooden seat with faded blue cushions that had weathered countless seasons and family gatherings. Christopher approached it hesitantly, as if unsure whether he was welcome to sit beside me. "Hey, he asked, gesturing to the empty space. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. The swing creaked under his weight, a sound I'd heard dozens of times during family barbecues and holiday visits, but tonight it felt loaded with significance. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sun set behind May's neighbor's oak tree, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed inappropriate for such a heavy moment. "I found them this morning," he said finally. "The letters, the note. I sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours just staring at your handwriting." His voice carried a quality I'd rarely heard, vulnerability stripped of any attempt at control or explanation. No defensiveness, no immediate rush to justify or minimize what I'd discovered. "The coffee got cold," he continued, a small smile flickering across his face. "First time in 18 years I've let your coffee go to waste." "Tell me about her," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. Not the Ashley from the letters. The real one. The one you knew. Christopher leaned back against the swing's wooden slats, his eyes focused on something far beyond May's carefully tended garden. We were lab partners senior year. Organic chemistry. She was brilliant. The kind of brilliant that made everything look effortless. She'd show up to class 5 minutes late with coffee stains on her shirt and still understand concepts that left me staring at textbooks until midnight. I found myself genuinely curious about this woman who'd occupied such a large space in my husband's heart. What happened between you? Nothing. Everything. We spent that entire semester in study groups, walking across campus after late sessions in the library, talking about everything except what was happening between us. There was this moment the week before graduation outside the chemistry building. We were both heading to our cars and she stopped walking and turned to look at me. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his jacket. A nervous habit I'd noticed countless times over the years but never connected to anything specific. She said, "In another life we would have been something amazing." And I just stood there like an idiot watching her walk away. By the time I worked up the courage to call her, she'd already moved to Seattle for graduate school. Different coast, different life. But you kept loving her, I said. It wasn't a question. I kept wondering, he corrected. About timing, about chances not taken, about whether the biggest mistake of my life was letting her disappear without telling her how I felt. And then I met you 6 months later and you were so alive, so present, so real. Ashley became this ghost I carried. Not because she was better than you, but because she was unfinished business. The honesty in his voice was almost painful to hear. I'd expected defensiveness, attempts to minimize his feelings for Ashley or maximize his feelings for me. Instead, he was offering something much more complex and difficult to process. Those letters, I said. Were you planning to send them? Christopher shook his head. They were therapy. My own pathetic way of trying to finally put her to rest. I thought if I could write down everything I'd never said, maybe I could stop carrying it around. The plan was to burn them once I'd gotten it all out. But you kept them instead. I kept them because burning them felt like erasing the only proof that those feelings had been real. And I wasn't ready to let go of being the man who'd loved 2 women, even if one of them never knew it. The question I'd been avoiding all day finally forced its way out. Was I ever enough? He turned to face me fully for the first time since sitting down, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. Not the dramatic kind that accompany grand apologies, but the quiet kind that come with genuine grief. You were everything, he said, his voice breaking slightly. You were morning coffee and midnight fevers and Emma's first steps. You were real life, real love, real partnership. Ashley was a dream I never let myself wake up from. But dreams aren't life, Jessica. They're just longing dressed up in what-ifs. The tears came then, not the angry sobs I'd expected but something softer, more like relief. We sat in the growing darkness, the porch swing moving gently back and forth, while 18 years of marriage rearranged themselves in my mind. I don't know how to forgive this, I said eventually. I don't even know if forgiveness is the right word for what needs to happen. I don't either, he admitted. I just know I don't want to lose you because I was too much of a coward to deal with my own ghosts. I looked at this man I'd shared a life with, seeing him perhaps more clearly than I ever had. Flawed, human, carrying wounds I'd never known existed. The Christopher sitting beside me wasn't the perfect husband I'd imagined I'd married, but he was real in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. Thank you, I said finally, for being honest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it felt like the beginning of something. Maybe not the marriage we'd had before, but possibly something more genuine, built on truth instead of the comfortable illusions we'd both been maintaining. 3 days at Maze had felt like a lifetime, but returning home felt like stepping into a museum of our former life. Christopher had driven me back in silence, both of us acutely aware that we were crossing a threshold into unknown territory. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Same red mailbox, same potted geraniums on the front steps that I'd planted in April. But everything felt different. The wooden box sat exactly where I'd left it on our bedroom dresser, untouched but somehow transformed. The cherry wood seemed less ominous now, more like what it actually was. Just a container that had held secrets too heavy for one person to carry alone. The emerald scarf lay folded neatly beside it, no longer binding the letters together but somehow still present, like a witness to everything that had unfolded. You didn't hide it, I observed, running my fingers along the box's smooth edge. What would be the point? Christopher replied from the doorway. Besides, it was never really mine to hide. Those letters. They were as much about you as they were about her. About the man I was when I wasn't being honest with either of us. Emma appeared at dinner that evening, her teenage radar for family drama finely tuned as always. She studied our faces across the kitchen table, clearly noting the careful way we moved around each other, the deliberate politeness that had replaced our usual comfortable familiarity. "Are you guys getting divorced?" she asked with the brutal directness that only 17-year-olds possess. "We're figuring some things out," I said, catching Christopher's eye across the table. "But no, we're not getting divorced." "Good," Emma said, stabbing her pasta with unnecessary force. "Because I cannot handle any more drama before senior year. I have enough stress with college applications." Her matter-of-fact acceptance somehow made the moment feel both lighter and more real. This was our family, imperfect, complicated, but still ours to figure out. Later that evening, Christopher found me in the living room, curled up in the reading chair with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. He settled onto the couch, maintaining careful distance but clearly wanting to talk. "I need to tell you about her laugh," he said suddenly. Ashley's laugh was infectious. The kind that made everyone around her start laughing too, even if they hadn't heard the joke. She'd throw her whole head back, completely unself-conscious. I felt a flicker of something that might have been jealousy but pushed it aside. "Tell me more." She read everything. Fiction, poetry, dense philosophy texts that she'd quote at random moments. Her favorite book was The Unbearable Lightness of Being. She carried a battered paperback copy everywhere. Said it reminded her that everything was both meaningful and meaningless at the same time. As he spoke, I found myself building a mental picture of this woman who'd inhabited such a large corner of my husband's heart. Not the threatening phantom I'd imagined, but a real person with quirks and passions and the kind of intellectual intensity that would have appealed to Christopher's serious nature. "She sounds wonderful," I said and meant it. Christopher looked surprised. "I thought you'd hate hearing about her." "I thought I would too. But hating her feels pointless. She didn't know about me, didn't choose to be your secret. And honestly, if she was important enough for you to carry around for 21 years, then she must have been pretty special." Something shifted in Christopher's expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude for permission to remember someone fondly without it feeling like a betrayal. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes you believe in fresh starts and clean slates. Christopher appeared in the kitchen with the wooden box under his arm and a determined expression I recognized from major household projects. "I want to burn them," he said without preamble. "All of them. Would you do it with me?" The request surprised me with its intimacy. This wasn't something he needed to do alone anymore. It was something we could do together. A ritual that acknowledged the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. We built a fire in the backyard pit we'd installed 2 summers ago for Emma's friend gatherings. The flames caught quickly, sending sparks up into the crisp air. Christopher opened the box one final time, removing the 13 letters with ceremony but no drama. "Should we read them first?" I asked. "One last time." He shook his head. "I know what they say. And you've already seen enough." The first letter caught fire immediately, Christopher's careful handwriting disappearing into orange and gold flames. Ashley's name curled and blackened, then vanished entirely. We fed the letters to the fire one by one, watching 21 years of longing transform into smoke and ash. "She would have liked you," Christopher said as the 5th letter dissolved into embers. "Ashley, you have the same stubbornness, the same way of seeing through nonsense." "Maybe in another life we could have been friends," I replied and felt surprised by how much I meant it. The 13th and final letter, the one that had shattered my understanding of our marriage, resisted the flames for a moment longer than the others. I watched the paper curl at the edges, saw my own name disappear first, followed by Ashley's until only meaningless ash remained. As the last fragments crumbled into the fire, I found myself whispering words I hadn't planned. We did the best we could even with what we didn't say. Christopher heard me. His hand found mine in the growing darkness, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of 18 years together but somehow feeling new, unencumbered by the weight of secrets we no longer had to carry. He didn't respond with words, just squeezed my hand gently as we watched the fire burn down to glowing coals. The silence felt different than it had for months. Not heavy with unspoken truths, but peaceful in the way that comes after difficult conversations have been completed. That night we went to bed without grand declarations or renewed vows. No promises about perfect love or fairy tale endings. Just two people who'd decided that imperfect honesty was better than comfortable illusions, that truth, even painful truth, was a stronger foundation than the prettiest lies. Christopher fell asleep first, his breathing steady and untroubled in a way I hadn't heard in months. I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling and processing the strange lightness I felt. We weren't the couple we'd been a week ago, and we'd never be that couple again. But maybe, if we were careful and brave and very honest with each other, we could become something better. Something real enough to last, built on who we actually were instead of who we'd pretended to be. The wooden box sat empty on the dresser, no longer hiding anything, just waiting to be filled with whatever came next. The empty wooden box became an unexpected compass for our new beginning. In the weeks that followed the burning ceremony, Christopher and I moved around each other with the careful attention of people learning to dance together for the first time. Not the passionate urgency of newlyweds, but something more deliberate. The conscious choice to build intimacy from honesty rather than habit. Our first new ritual emerged organically on a Tuesday evening when neither of us felt like eating alone. Christopher appeared in the kitchen doorway as I contemplated the contents of our refrigerator, both of us still navigating the strange politeness that had replaced our easy familiarity. "Want to cook something together?" he asked, his voice carrying the tentative quality of someone testing uncertain ground. We settled on pasta. Simple enough to manage without elaborate coordination, complex enough to require actual collaboration. I chopped vegetables while he prepared the sauce, our movements creating a careful choreography around each other. When our hands brushed reaching for the same wooden spoon, neither of us pulled away immediately. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. "Emma called," Christopher mentioned, stirring the simmering tomatoes. "She wants to know if we're acting normal again for her birthday next month." "What did you tell her?" "That we're working on a new version of normal. One that might actually be better than the old one." Dinner tasted different that night. Not because the food was exceptional, but because we'd created it together without pretending everything was fine. We talked about Emma's college applications, the neighbor's new fence, the weather forecast. Ordinary conversations that felt extraordinary because we were having them as people who'd decided to stop lying to each other. Walking became our second ritual. Short loops around our neighborhood at first, then longer routes that took us past the elementary school where Emma had learned to ride a bike, the park where we'd had countless family picnics, the coffee shop where we sometimes stopped for weekend breakfast. These walks felt like reclaiming familiar territory, seeing our shared landscape through eyes that were no longer clouded by secrets. "I used to wonder if you were happy," Christopher said during one of these walks, 3 weeks after the letter burning. "Really happy, not just content or comfortable." I was too afraid to ask because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Were you happy?" I asked in return. He considered this for several steps before answering. "I was happy in moments. Watching you teach Emma to braid her hair, seeing you laugh at terrible movies, the way you hummed while folding laundry. But I was carrying so much guilt about Ashley that I couldn't let myself be completely present for the happiness." These conversations felt like archaeological excavations, carefully uncovering layers of our relationship that had been buried under years of polite avoidance and comfortable assumptions. The couple's therapy began in November, in Dr. Martinez's office with its soft lighting and strategically placed tissue boxes. I'd resisted the idea initially. Therapy felt like admitting failure, like broadcasting our private struggles to a stranger. But our first session revealed how much we'd been trying to solve complex emotional problems with insufficient tools. "Guilt is a particularly insidious emotion," Dr. Martinez explained during our third visit. "It convinces us that suffering in silence is somehow noble, that protecting others from difficult truths is an act of love. But silence often causes more damage than honesty." Christopher nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I thought I was protecting Jessica by not telling her about Ashley. I thought I was being a good husband by carrying that burden alone." "And Jessica," Dr. Martinez turned to me, "how did it feel to discover that protection? Like being told I wasn't strong enough to handle the truth. Like 18 years of partnership was actually me living in a carefully constructed fantasy while Christopher dealt with the real complexities alone." The sessions forced us to examine patterns we'd never questioned. Christopher's tendency to withdraw when facing emotional difficulty. My habit of smoothing over conflicts before we'd actually resolved them. The way we'd both learned to interpret silence as peace rather than recognizing it as avoidance. Homework from therapy spilled into our daily life. Asking direct questions instead of making assumptions. Sharing immediate reactions rather than waiting for better moments. Learning to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to fix or explain it away. The journal started as an assignment from Dr. Martinez. Write down things that feel true each day, even if they're contradictory, but evolved into something more personal. I bought a simple composition notebook and wrote things that still matter on the cover in careful block letters. Some entries were single words: coffee, Emma's laugh, honesty. Other days, whole pages poured out. Reflections on memories that felt different now, observations about Christopher that I'd never articulated, questions about what kind of marriage we were building from the ashes of our assumptions. On a particularly difficult day in December, I wrote simply, Christopher. Still here. Spring brought unexpected lightness. Not the forced cheerfulness of people trying to convince themselves everything was fine, but the genuine ease that comes from no longer carrying secrets. Christopher started singing in the shower again. Old songs I hadn't heard in years. I found myself actually listening when he told stories about his workday instead of just waiting for my turn to speak. Emma noticed the change during her spring break visit home from her first year of college. You guys seem different, she said over dinner. Like you actually like each other again. We're learning how, I replied, catching Christopher's eye across the table. Good, Emma said pragmatically. Because I was getting tired of feeling like I needed to be the family therapist every time I came home. The first family dinner we hosted after the crisis happened almost exactly 1 year later. A casual Sunday gathering with May, Emma, and Christopher's brother David and his family. I'd been nervous about it, wondering if our rebuilt foundation was strong enough to support the weight of normal family dynamics. But the afternoon unfolded with surprising naturalness. Christopher and David argued good-naturedly about football while helping me set the table. Emma played DJ from her phone, filling the house with music that spanned 3 generations of family favorites. May brought her famous apple pie in the kind of gentle presence that made everything feel possible. Remember when you used to make us dance in the living room after dinner? Emma asked while we cleared dessert plates. We still could, Christopher said, looking at me with raised eyebrows. So we did. Cleared the furniture to the sides of the room and danced to Emma's playlist while May clapped from her chair and David's kids giggled at the spectacle of adults being silly. Christopher spun me around like he had in our first apartment. But this time I wasn't dizzy with the intoxication of new love. I was steady with the deeper satisfaction of love that had survived crisis and chosen itself again. That night, after everyone had gone home and Emma had returned to her dorm, Christopher and I cleaned up together in comfortable quiet. The house felt different than it had a year ago. Not just because we'd rearranged some furniture or updated the paint, but because it was inhabited by people who knew each other more completely. Getting ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had laugh lines around her eyes and silver threads in her hair that hadn't been there when this story began. She looked older certainly, but also more real somehow, less polished but more genuine. Christopher was already in bed when I joined him, reading a book about sustainable gardening that he'd picked up somewhere. The sight of him there, solid and present and no longer carrying invisible burdens, made my chest feel warm and full. I settled beside him, close enough to feel his warmth but not demanding immediate attention. The house hummed around us, the refrigerator cycling on, the heater adjusting to the cool October night, the familiar settling sounds of a home where people had chosen to stay and build something together. I wasn't the past, I whispered into the soft darkness. I was the life. Christopher set down his book and turned toward me, his eyes serious but peaceful. Yes, he said simply. You were always the life. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed him completely. Not because he was telling me what I wanted to hear, but because we'd finally learned to tell each other the truth. The empty wooden box became an unexpected compass for our new beginning. In the weeks that followed the burning ceremony, Christopher and I moved around each other with the careful attention of people learning to dance together for the first time. Not the passionate urgency of newlyweds, but something more deliberate. The conscious choice to build intimacy from honesty rather than habit. Our first new ritual emerged organically on a Tuesday evening when neither of us felt like eating alone. Christopher appeared in the kitchen doorway as I contemplated the contents of our refrigerator, both of us still navigating the strange politeness that had replaced our easy familiarity. "Want to cook something together?" he asked, his voice carrying the tentative quality of someone testing uncertain ground. We settled on pasta. Simple enough to manage without elaborate coordination, complex enough to require actual collaboration. I chopped vegetables while he prepared the sauce, our movements creating a careful choreography around each other. When our hands brushed reaching for the same wooden spoon, neither of us pulled away immediately. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. "Emma called," Christopher mentioned, stirring the simmering tomatoes. "She wants to know if we're acting normal again for her birthday next month." "What did you tell her?" "That we're working on a new version of normal. One that might actually be better than the old one." Dinner tasted different that night. Not because the food was exceptional, but because we'd created it together without pretending everything was fine. We talked about Emma's college applications, the neighbor's new fence, the weather forecast. Ordinary conversations that felt extraordinary because we were having them as people who'd decided to stop lying to each other. Walking became our second ritual. Short loops around our neighborhood at first, then longer routes that took us past the elementary school where Emma had learned to ride a bike, the park where we'd had countless family picnics, the coffee shop where we sometimes stopped for weekend breakfast. These walks felt like reclaiming familiar territory, seeing our shared landscape through eyes that were no longer clouded by secrets. "I used to wonder if you were happy," Christopher said during one of these walks, 3 weeks after the letter burning. "Really happy, not just content or comfortable." I was too afraid to ask because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Were you happy?" I asked in return. He considered this for several steps before answering. "I was happy in moments. Watching you teach Emma to braid her hair, seeing you laugh at terrible movies, the way you hummed while folding laundry. But I was carrying so much guilt about Ashley that I couldn't let myself be completely present for the happiness." These conversations felt like archaeological excavations, carefully uncovering layers of our relationship that had been buried under years of polite avoidance and comfortable assumptions. The couple's therapy began in November, in Dr. Martinez's office with its soft lighting and strategically placed tissue boxes. I'd resisted the idea initially. Therapy felt like admitting failure, like broadcasting our private struggles to a stranger. But our first session revealed how much we'd been trying to solve complex emotional problems with insufficient tools. "Guilt is a particularly insidious emotion," Dr. Martinez explained during our third visit. "It convinces us that suffering in silence is somehow noble, that protecting others from difficult truths is an act of love. But silence often causes more damage than honesty." Christopher nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I thought I was protecting Jessica by not telling her about Ashley. I thought I was being a good husband by carrying that burden alone." "And Jessica," Dr. Martinez turned to me, "how did it feel to discover that protection? Like being told I wasn't strong enough to handle the truth. Like 18 years of partnership was actually me living in a carefully constructed fantasy while Christopher dealt with the real complexities alone." The sessions forced us to examine patterns we'd never questioned. Christopher's tendency to withdraw when facing emotional difficulty. My habit of smoothing over conflicts before we'd actually resolved them. The way we'd both learned to interpret silence as peace rather than recognizing it as avoidance. The journal started as an assignment from Dr. Martinez but evolved into something deeply personal. I bought a simple composition notebook and wrote things that still matter on the cover in careful block letters. Some entries were single words: coffee, Emma's laugh, honesty. Other days whole pages poured out, reflections on memories that felt different now, observations about Christopher that I'd never articulated, questions about what kind of marriage we were building. Spring brought unexpected lightness. Christopher started singing in the shower again, old songs I hadn't heard in years. I found myself actually listening when he told stories about his workday instead of just waiting for my turn to speak. 1 year later, we hosted our first family dinner since the crisis. Emma was home from college. May brought her famous apple pie, and Christopher's brother David came with his family. The afternoon unfolded with surprising naturalness. Laughter filling the house, Emma playing DJ, everyone dancing in the living room after dinner like we used to do when Emma was small. That night, after everyone had gone home, Christopher and I cleaned up together in comfortable quiet. Getting ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back had laugh lines and silver threads that hadn't been there when this story began. She looked older but more real, less polished but more genuine. I settled beside Christopher in bed, close enough to feel his warmth. The house hummed around us with familiar settling sounds of a home where people had chosen to stay and build something together. I wasn't the past, I whispered into the soft darkness. I was the life. Christopher set down his book and turned toward me, his eyes serious but peaceful. Yes, he said simply. You were always the life. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed him completely, not because he was telling me what I wanted to hear, but because we'd finally learned to tell each other the truth. If this story of love, betrayal, and redemption had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Jessica left those letters on the breakfast table with that simple, powerful note. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more emotional stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.